Protectionism will likely be a hot topic when U.S. President Joe Biden visits Canada next month. Why? Well, just a few days ago, Biden doubled down on a previously announced Buy American approach for infrastructure projects in his State of the Union address.
All construction materials used in federal infrastructure projects to be made in America. Made in America. I mean it.
Reaction from businesses here in Canada has been swift. The BC Lumber Trade Council says it's concerning, while the Canadian manufacturers and exporters is calling it bad news. I spoke with U.S. Ambassador to Canada David Cohen late last week. I want to start off on the president's remarks in the State of the Union the other night, in particular around Buy American. When he said that he will introduce standards that will require all construction materials used on federal infrastructure projects to be made in America and made with American products, did he mean North America or just America?
I think it's pretty clear he meant America. But I want to make clear that this is nothing new. I mean, Buy America provisions have been a part of federal infrastructure policy and program in the United States since 1933. There happens to be a new Federal Infrastructure Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, and the government is in the process of writing and proposing regulations as to how that money will be spent. And we've reached the point where those regulations will be published. There'll be an opportunity for public comment. And that's what the president was talking about. But it is absolutely essential that I make the point and reinforce it that we are talking about federal infrastructure spending under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act. We are not talking about the massive volume of trade that occurs between the United States and Canada, and in which Canadian companies compete. We're not talking about the free trade environment which exists between Canada and the United States. You've heard the statistic, $2.6 billion a day in trade between Canada and the United States.
But Canada has in the past, through different standards introduced in other iterations, been able to carve out exemptions. I know that that has yet to be announced. I spoke with your counterpart in the United States, Ambassador Hillman, this week, who said that Canada has not yet received any assurances that there will be a carve-out for this country.
So you'll be pleased to know I watched the interview. And to be fair, she said Canada has not received assurances, but there are ongoing discussions, as there always are. And as I said, there will be regulations that are issued, and there'll be public comment. Canada will have the opportunity to comment publicly. I don't want to create any expectations. Please don't tease this show of United States Ambassador to Canada holds out hope that Canada will get waivers and exceptions. I just can't say that. But there'll be a productive dialogue, as there always is in this case. But again, I have to reinforce that when I see representatives of the Canadian business community talking about the potential rupture to supply chain integration, with all due respect, I don't think they understand what's going on here. When they talk about supply chain integration, they almost always use the automobile sector as an example. Buy America has nothing to do with the automobile sector.
I mean, it does very specifically have to do with lumber. That's a word that the president used in his speech.
Lumber for federal infrastructure products under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act.
Sure, but there is Canadian lumber used for federal infrastructure.
That is correct.
So that would affect the lumber industry potentially if we don't get a carve-out.
Correct, but let me quantify it for you. The United States economy overall, call it $25 trillion, okay? The spending under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, call it maximum a couple $100 million a year. So you're talking about less than 1% of the overall trade economy is implicated by Buy American.
So the infrastructure, the federal infrastructure projects that the president referred to in the State of the Union address is only worth $200 million?
No, I'm sorry. Only it's worth a couple billion a year, is the point. But it's less than 1% of the overall economy.
But
we're not going to disrupt. We're not going to disrupt businesses. I mean, think about the worst case is that somebody in the lumber industry could have less than 1% of its business implicated.
I take your point on the numbers as they exist, but I think it's the principle of it that A, is scary to certain sectors of the economy that largely depend on their exports to the United States. And while that may be the case with federal infrastructure projects right now, I don't read anything into what the president said that, you know, should there be a huge amount of them in the future or that number grow, then, you know, exponentially so would the effect on Canada if we were shut out.
Well, I don't think, I mean, this is an unprecedented investment in infrastructure, and it's for a 5-year period. So I don't think there should be a big concern of, well, you know, slippery slope. If you've got it now for this act, there could be even bigger numbers in the future because, as I said, this is an unprecedented high investment in infrastructure in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act. But again, I understand the concern. But I think you have to put it in the context of the overall trade relationship, the overall volume of trade, and the fact that the president's not talking about a structure of protectionist provisions that would limit access of Canadian businesses to the private sector market in the United States. That could have a significantly higher impact than a program limited just to federal infrastructure investment.
So if the impact is limited, why not carve out an exemption for Canada? Why kind of put your closest friend and ally through the rigmarole of worrying about the potential impact of this?
Well, I think that, first of all, I think there has to be, I'd be worried if it was a rational worry. I think it's not a fact-based concern by the Canadian businesses that have expressed concern about it, number one. Number two, there are always ongoing discussions. And while I can't hold out any hope, what waivers or exceptions might be created as a result of the regulatory process, you know, clearly Canada will be listened to as a part of that dialogue and what it is that we're going through as we do this. And the third thing I will say is, and again, I've made the first part of this point, which is this isn't anything new. I mean, this is, Buy America provisions have been around since 1933. It is also not anything unique to the United States. Every country has, or almost every country that manufactures goods has preferences that are often built in to favor manufacturers of that country. And I include in that list a little country called Canada.
Sure. And we're not pure. I get it.
Well, it's not a matter of being pure. I think it's totally appropriate. And Canada has used those protections in modern memory. It was used at the beginning of the pandemic to exclude United States companies from participating in procurement around products related to fighting the pandemic. And so it's not a matter of not being pure. I think it is a tried and true tool to stimulate domestic economies that every country takes advantage of.
Except for the economic argument is often challenged, right? Because sometimes it makes things more expensive. But the way in which the rhetoric is and has become through the last administration and this one very dominant in public discourse, particularly for a political audience. I noted to the other ambassador that in that speech, you know, one of the most popular things across party lines were those comments. So I think I understand your criticism of the business community here based on the facts that you're presenting. But I think maybe also it would be understandable for them to exercise that criticism given the level of rhetoric and the number of times through which we have had to fight for exemptions in the past decade.
Okay. So I'm not criticizing the business community. I understand the concern, and they're expressing their opinion as they should. And I'm certainly not criticizing the Canadian government, which has been a consistent and effective advocate for, I prefer a phrase of carving Canada in to these programs as opposed to exempting them or carving them out from the prohibitions. I understand the give and take and the tension, but I'm trying to provide some context as to the relatively small numbers in the overall trade relationship here, and that for Joe Biden and for the Biden-Harris administration, I'm going to push back very hard on comparisons to prior administrations, because the limited Buy America philosophy and approach that President Biden has laid out does not compare to protectionist policies that have been put in place by prior administrations in the United States and by other governments around the world. The dominant theme of Joe Biden's trade philosophy and of his trade policy, and it certainly applies to U.S.-Canada trade policy, is free trade. And
that isn't the perception of the Canadian government here, though. At
well,
least as conveyed to us.
I don't know whether it's a perception of the government. It's not the perception of many businesses, but you have to look at the statistics. I mean, one of my favorite expressions is that everyone's entitled to their own opinion, but they're not entitled to their own facts. The facts are the facts. And $2.6 billion a day in trade between our two countries across the border, almost all of it free trade. It is a signal.
Except for Canada feels like it has to fight for a lot of that.
So I don't think there's been any fighting. I really don't.
I mean, when you have to fight to carve out an exemption around electric vehicles or around Buy American, right?
So Canada has ended up in a very good position because of the favored relationship that it has with the United States. And frankly, they've ended up that way because they've been effective in the way in which they communicate and the way in which they talk about these issues.